Tiny Tim was one of the most unique and unforgettable performers in music history. With his falsetto voice, eccentric persona, and love for old-time tunes, he captivated audiences from the 1960s until his final days. But behind the quirky charm and showmanship was a man who faced struggles with fading fame, declining health, and personal hardships. In the end, his tragic passing came in a way as dramatic as his life, collapsing on stage doing what he loved most. Today, we take a deep dive into the tragic passing of Tiny Tim, his rise to fame, his struggles, and the heartbreaking end of an entertainer unlike any other. Born Herbert Carey in April 1932, Tiny Tim only ever wanted to make people smile. But his early life was anything but joyful. His mother was already in her 40s when she gave birth to him, and the delivery was so difficult that doctors had to perform a C-section to bring him safely into the world. Unfortunately, the home he was born into was far from peaceful. His family was a study in contrast. His mother came from an Orthodox Jewish background, while his father was a Maronite Christian from the rural mountains of Lebanon. This rich mixed heritage contributed to his distinctive appearance, but it also made for a tense and often divided household. His parents clashed constantly, and from a young age, Tiny Tim found himself playing the role of peacemaker. His efforts weren't in vain. He even managed to keep his parents' marriage from falling apart. After years of financial struggles and relentless arguing, his father finally had enough. He packed his bags, ready to leave for good. But before he could walk out the door, Tiny Tim, who was at the time quite literally tiny, stood in front of him, pleading with him not to go. Moved by his son's tearful desperation, his father changed his mind and decided to stay. But family turmoil wasn't the only danger he faced growing up. On Independence Day in 1935, Tiny Tim had a near brush with disaster, almost quite literally going up in flames. A stray firecracker flew through his window, igniting a pile of clothes and quickly spreading through the house. Luckily, his father jumped into action, extinguishing the fire with his bare hands before it could cause serious harm. While the family survived that close call, it was just one of many chaotic moments that shaped his childhood. Through it all, Tiny Tim found solace in music. A natural talent, he taught himself to play several instruments, including the violin, mandolin, and eventually the ukulele, his signature instrument. But while his musical skills were impressive, what truly set him apart was his unusual high-pitched falsetto voice. The discovery of his now iconic singing style, however, was nothing more than a happy accident. In a 1968 interview, Tiny Tim reflected on the moment that changed his life forever, the discovery of his signature falsetto. He recalled singing along to the radio when he suddenly realized something extraordinary. "I had something of a revelation," he said. "I learned that I had another top register." What began as an innocent moment of play quickly turned into a defining realization, one that would shape the rest of his career. To Tiny Tim, this wasn't just a new vocal technique, it was a deeply spiritual experience. Despite his mother's Orthodox Jewish roots, he had always been a devout Christian, viewing Jesus Christ as a superhero, much like Captain America. He believed that his falsetto voice was a divine gift, something almost supernatural. He later described his discovery as a religious experience, as if even the angels themselves could hear it. Music became his refuge. While his parents argued, he would retreat into his bedroom, immersing himself in melodies and lyrics. By the age of 5, he had already taught himself to play the guitar. Unfortunately, his love for music didn't make him popular with the other kids. He adored baseball, but as he later admitted, he was terrible at it. His inability to swing a bat meant he was always the last one picked for games, if he was picked at all. But while sports weren't in his future, A professional team would eventually welcome him in an entirely different way. Even though he dreamed of a musical career, Tiny Tim initially tried to follow a more conventional path out of respect for his father. As a teenager, he took on various odd jobs to help support his struggling family. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on work, the music inside him refused to be silenced. When he later moved to Los Angeles, it became clear that he couldn't suppress his passion any longer. Tiny Tim never expected to be famous. Soft-spoken and deeply sensitive, he assumed his talents would always remain a personal joy rather than a ticket to stardom. Still, he couldn't ignore his desire to be part of the entertainment world. To get as close as possible, he took a job as a messenger at MGM Studios, delivering documents for the very industry he longed to be a part of. By night, however, he chased his real dream, performing in amateur clubs around the city. His falsetto was impossible to ignore, and soon the right people started listening. Tiny Tim longed to be admired, not just for his music, but for his appearance as well. Aware that he didn't fit the traditional mold of a leading man, he decided to model himself after one of Hollywood's most legendary heartthrobs, Rudolph Valentino. When he saw a poster of the silent film icon with what appeared to be long flowing hair, he made up his mind. He would grow out his own locks to match. There was just one problem. He had completely misread the image. Valentino had never actually worn his hair long. The poster Tiny Tim had admired was from The Chic, 1921, in which Valentino was simply wearing a decorative tassel on his head. By the time Tiny Tim realized his mistake, his signature curls had already become part of his look. So rather than cutting them off, he decided to keep them. While audiences embraced his unique persona, his mother wasn't quite as amused. As Tiny Tim's stage performances became more eccentric, she grew increasingly worried about his mental state. His quirky behavior, flamboyant style, and unusual falsetto led her to believe something was seriously wrong. Concerned for his well-being, or perhaps for the family's reputation, she tried to have him committed to Bellevue Hospital for a psychiatric evaluation. Fortunately, his father intervened, stopping the attempt before it could go any further. With his father's support, Tiny Tim continued developing his act. Over the next few years, he became a fixture in the Greenwich Village music scene, performing regularly and slowly building a devoted cult following. It was during this time that he introduced what would become his most famous song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. However, while his performance style was coming together, his identity as an entertainer was still evolving. Throughout his early career, Tiny Tim experimented with numerous stage names, each one more unusual than the last. Some of the most bizarre included Texarkana Tex, Judas K. Foxglove, Vernon Castle, Emmett Swink, Derry Dover, and even Sir Timothy Timms. Where he came up with these odd names remains a mystery, but the story behind how he finally settled on Tiny Tim would be nothing short of comedic gold. At 6 feet 1 inch, he towered over most people and was usually the tallest performer on any stage. However, his unusual stage name came about entirely by accident. One night, after following a little person's act, his manager saw an opportunity for a joke. He introduced the lanky falsetto-singing performer as Tiny Tim, and the name stuck for life. Slowly but surely, Tiny Tim's peculiar voice and eccentric personality caught the attention of talent scouts. After making a few cameo appearances in films in 1963 and 1968, he finally got his big break. He was invited as the featured guest on the premiere episode of the wildly popular comedy variety show Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. All he had to do was walk on stage, play his ukulele, and embrace his 15 minutes of fame. But what happened next was unforgettable. His entrance was as unassuming as it was bizarre. As co-host Dan Rowan introduced him, Tiny Tim casually walked onto the stage carrying a shopping bag. Without saying a word, he reached inside, pulled out his ukulele, and then launched into a high-pitched, glass-shattering medley of A Tisket, A Tasket, and On the Good Ship Lollipop. The audience, stunned by the absurdity of what they were witnessing, could only sit back and watch in amazement. Tiny Tim's debut left everyone in shock, and likely with ringing ears. But as bizarre as his performance was, audiences simply couldn't get enough. His appearance on Laugh-In was such a hit that he was invited back twice more that same year. It was during one of these return performances that he introduced what would become his signature song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Whether people were laughing with him or at him hardly mattered. He had become a sensation. Tiny Tim went on to record multiple albums, though many of them were geared toward children, and enjoyed the perks of his newfound stardom. One of the highlights of his success was getting to fulfill a lifelong dream, stepping onto the ice with his favorite hockey team, the Toronto Maple Leafs. There was just one small problem. He had absolutely no idea how to skate. Despite his deep love for sports, Tiny Tim had never been an athlete. His attempt to glide across the rink quickly turned into a comical struggle, as members of the Maple Leafs had to help keep him from falling. But instead of being embarrassed, he embraced the moment with his usual quirky charm. After the event, he joked, "I was always athletic spiritually, not physically." Adding to the confusion surrounding his eccentric persona, many fans initially assumed he wasn't American at all. With his dapper vintage suits, exaggerated mannerisms, and distinctive falsetto, audiences speculated that his entire act was a gimmick. Some even believed he was British, thinking his unusual way of speaking was part of a carefully crafted stage persona. But in time, it became clear. Tiny Tim wasn't putting on an act. His quirks were entirely genuine. While he was best known for his music, some of Tiny Tim's most talked-about television appearances had little to do with his singing. He had a way of making audiences both captivated and deeply uncomfortable. And nowhere was this more evident than on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson. On December 17, 1969, he took part in a live televised event unlike anything audiences had ever seen before, one that would cement his place in pop culture history. That moment was made possible by a chance encounter at a Philadelphia department store. During a book signing, Tiny Tim met a young woman who instantly stole his heart. She introduced herself as Miss Vicky, and he was so enchanted by her that he tracked her down after the event. What began as a whirlwind romance quickly turned into something much bigger, a highly publicized long-distance courtship that the whole world would soon witness unfold. Tiny Tim shocked the world when he made a surprise announcement on The Tonight Show. After just a few months of long-distance dating, he had proposed to Miss Vicky. Host Johnny Carson was so thrilled by the news that he made an unexpected offer. He would host the wedding live on television. Tiny Tim eagerly accepted, setting the stage for one of the most watched weddings in television history. On December 17, 1969, an estimated 40 million viewers tuned in to witness the unconventional ceremony. Tiny Tim, ever the showman, gave a performance unlike any other as he exchanged vows with his teenage bride, 17-year-old Victoria Budinger, known to the public as Miss Vicky. Despite the fairy tale spectacle, cracks in their marriage began forming almost immediately. 2 years later, the couple welcomed their first and only child, a baby girl. True to his signature sense of humor, Tiny Tim chose a name that was both sentimental and self-referential. He called his daughter Tulip, inspired by his hit song Tiptoe Through the Tulips. But despite the seemingly sweet tribute, Tiny Tim had a complicated relationship with children. In truth, He had never been particularly fond of them, making fatherhood an awkward fit. As time went on, it became clear that Tiny Tim had been more infatuated with the idea of love than with marriage itself. He was captivated by the thrill of the chase, but once the excitement of his highly publicized wedding faded, so did his interest in Miss Vicky. The relationship that had played out in front of millions soon unraveled behind closed doors. By 1977, after years of growing apart, their marriage officially came to an end. But while Tiny Tim continued to embrace his eccentric lifestyle, his ex-wife took a darker turn. After their divorce, Miss Vicky became entangled in a scandal of her own when she dated former Rabbi Fred Neulander, a man later convicted of orchestrating the murder of his own wife. However, Tiny Tim wasn't about to let his ex-wife be the only one making headlines. He had another marriage and more surprises still to come. By 1983, Tiny Tim was well past his days of mainstream fame, but that didn't stop him from finding love again. While performing at the Williams Club in New York, the 52-year-old entertainer caught the attention of a 23-year-old aspiring singer named Jan Alweis, better known as Miss Jan. Despite their unconventional pairing, a romance quickly blossomed, though their love story was far from picture perfect. Just a year into their relationship, the couple eloped in Las Vegas, exchanging vows in a tacky, over-the-top ceremony. But in an attempt to gain the approval of Jan's family, they held a second wedding in a synagogue the following year. However, despite the more traditional setting, their marriage was anything but conventional. According to Tiny Tim's third wife, Miss Sue, his second marriage was more of a formality than a true partnership. She later claimed that Tiny Tim and Miss Jan never actually lived together during their 11-year marriage. Instead of sharing a home, he purchased a separate house for Jan right next door. When he wasn't on the road, he would visit, but he never truly settled down. Their arrangement was, by all accounts, an open marriage. Miss Sue revealed that Tiny Tim and Jan had an understanding that allowed them to see other people, further reinforcing the idea that their relationship was more of a business agreement than a romantic one. Given this setup, it's likely that Tiny Tim met Miss Sue while he was still legally married to Jan. But that didn't stop him from making things official when the time came. Though the exact reason behind Tiny Tim's split from Jan remains unclear, he ultimately ended the marriage in 1995. And just as quickly as one chapter closed, another began. Wasting no time, he married Miss Sue later that same year. This time, there would be no separation, no open arrangement. She would stay by his side until the very end. By September 1996, Tiny Tim's days of mainstream fame were long behind him, and so unfortunately was his good health. Still, he remained a beloved figure to a small but devoted group of fans. In Montague, Massachusetts, he was welcomed with open arms, giving an enthusiastic interview before attending the local ukulele festival. But despite the warm reception, it was clear that his body was struggling to keep up. The energy that had once made him a star was beginning to fade. His heart, like his career, had endured more than its fair share of strain. While at the festival, Tiny Tim suffered a severe heart attack, collapsing in front of his stunned fans. He was rushed to the hospital where he remained for 3 weeks, his longest hospital stay since childhood. Doctors gave him a dire warning. His heart and overall health were in critical condition. Due to his weight, diabetes, and worsening heart disease, they urged him to stop performing immediately. But slowing down had never been in Tiny Tim's nature. Despite the risks, he couldn't bear to disappoint the people who still came to see him. Later that year, he accepted a final gig at a gala benefit hosted by the Women's Club of Minneapolis. Before the show, however, he admitted to his wife, Miss Sue, that something didn't feel right. He wasn't feeling well, But rather than cancel, he brushed aside his discomfort and took the stage one last time. Determined to give his audience what they came for, Tiny Tim powered through his set. But as the night drew to a close, tragedy struck. As he performed his most famous song, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, his heart gave out once more. This time, there would be no recovery. His final performance ended in the most tragic way possible, mid-song, mid-stage, in front of a crowd. Miss Sue rushed to his side, asking if he was all right. Barely able to speak, he whispered that he wasn't. As she tried to help him back to their table, he collapsed. Emergency responders did everything they could, but Tiny Tim never regained consciousness. The man who had spent his life serenading audiences with whimsical songs and eccentric charm had taken his final bow. And in the end, he wouldn't be tiptoeing through tulips, he would be pushing up daisies. Miss Sue ensured that Tiny Tim's final farewell was as fittingly unique as the man himself. When he was laid to rest, she made sure he was accompanied by only two things: his beloved ukulele and a single carefully preserved tulip. It was a simple yet poetic tribute to the one-hit wonder whose career had been defined by an odd mix of whimsy and melancholy. But even in death, there was something unusual about his final resting place. Tiny Tim's passing sent ripples through an unexpected community, the world of ukulele enthusiasts. While many had dismissed him as a novelty act, he had, in his own peculiar way, become one of the most recognizable ambassadors for the often overlooked instrument. His success had brought the ukulele into mainstream pop culture, if only for a fleeting moment. After his death, fans of the instrument mourned not just the man, but the attention he had briefly brought to their craft. Beyond the ukulele world, Tiny Tim's influence lived on in ways no one could have predicted. His signature high-pitched vocals and flamboyant stage presence inspired a wave of eccentric performers who followed in his footsteps. Some attempted to imitate his comedic falsetto, while others borrowed elements of his over-the-top showmanship. But while many tried, none ever quite captured the peculiar charm that had made him a household name, even if only for a short time. Tiny Tim had always understood the fleeting nature of fame. Throughout his career, he often reflected on how quickly the spotlight could fade, comparing celebrity status to a wilting flower. "We come and we go," he once mused in an interview, accepting that his time in the public eye had been a gift, one he believed had been granted by a higher power. His brief but unforgettable place in pop culture even foreshadowed trends that would emerge long after his heyday. When he and Miss Vicky exchanged vows on The Tonight Show, their wedding became one of the first major celebrity nuptials broadcast on live television. Decades later, reality TV and Hollywood stars would turn weddings into massive televised events. Long before viral talk show moments became a staple of late-night television, Tiny Tim had already made the... Despite widespread speculation that his eccentric persona was just an act, those who knew Tiny Tim insisted that he was exactly the same offstage as he was on. Sweet, shy, deeply religious, and constantly seeking to bring joy to others, his unusual mannerisms weren't part of a carefully crafted gimmick. They were simply who he was. Though his multiple marriages and peculiar habits made him seem unpredictable, Tiny Tim claimed to live by a strict sense of spiritual and physical purity. He avoided alcohol and other substances, believing in a more wholesome way of life. But while he stayed away from traditional vices, he had one major weakness: sweets. His obsession with sugar-loaded treats contributed significantly to his long-term health problems, ultimately playing a role in his decline. While the world knew him for old-fashioned tunes like Tiptoe Through the Tulips, Tiny Tim privately enjoyed more contemporary music. Though he rarely admitted it publicly, he had a soft spot for rock and pop hits of the day. He feared that embracing modern music might damage his carefully cultivated image as a performer devoted to the good old days. But behind closed doors, his tastes were far more eclectic than most realized. Throughout his life, Tiny Tim never followed a calculated career plan. Instead, he left everything to what he called God's will. He had no grand strategy for maintaining his fame. He simply took every opportunity as it came, trusting that his path was divinely guided. Some believe that if he had taken a more structured approach, his fame might have lasted longer than just 15 minutes. In the months after his passing, his final home became something of a shrine for his remaining fans. Miss Sue discovered that he had meticulously saved every scrap of memorabilia from his career: ticket stubs, newspaper clippings, and personal keepsakes. For a time, people would visit just to catch a glimpse of his quirky legacy. Eventually, though, the collection was put into storage, leaving only memories behind. But in some ways, Tiny Tim's time in the spotlight never truly ended. The eerie falsetto that made him famous found a second life in the horror genre. In 2010, Tiptoe Through the Tulips became the chilling theme song for the hit horror film Insidious, its haunting melody giving audiences a new reason to shiver. As a lifelong horror enthusiast, Tiny Tim likely would have been thrilled to know that even in death, his voice still had the power to leave people unsettled. Tiny Tim was a performer who defied expectations, embraced his uniqueness, and left an indelible mark on music history. Though his life ended tragically, his legacy continues through his recordings, his influence on pop culture, and the joy he brought to millions. What's your favorite Tiny Tim song or memory? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.